Listen closely. Rain lashed against the bulletproof glass of the Maybach like a barrage of gunfire. Inside sat a man who owned the city's underworld, a phantom forged in blood, cordite, and tailored Italian wool. He was untouchable, unfeeling, until a shadow stepped directly into the blinding glare of his headlights on a desolate, flooded street. She wasn't a rival boss or a trained assassin. She was a soaked, desperate woman society had deemed completely invisible, heavy, bruised, and at the absolute end of her rope. When the tinted window rolled down and the cold steel of a gun barrel met her forehead, she didn't beg for her life. Instead, she stared into the darkest, most terrifying eyes in the city and spoke a single, breathless sentence that shattered his entire empire from the inside out. The sky above Chicago didn't just rain. It wept violently, a torrential downpour that turned the asphalt of West Monroe Street into a slick, black mirror reflecting the bleeding neon signs of closed storefronts. Penelope Walsh dragged her feet through the rising puddles, her worn canvas sneakers long since saturated. She was 24, utterly alone, and carrying the entirety of her worldly possessions in a soggy cardboard box clutched to her chest. Society had a very specific way of treating women who looked like Penelope. At 260 pounds, she occupied more physical space than most, yet she had spent her entire life feeling entirely invisible. People didn't look at her. They looked past her, their eyes sliding off her soft, round features and heavy frame, as if she were an inconvenient piece of furniture in the room of life. The extra weight she carried was a physical manifestation of a trauma she couldn't outrun, a protective layer built year by year against a world that had only ever shown her teeth. But tonight, that layer felt like an anchor dragging her to the bottom of the ocean. Earlier that evening, the manager at O'Connor's Diner, a greasy spoon off Wabash Avenue, where she had scrubbed floors and served bitter coffee for 3 years, had fired her. He claimed it was restructuring, but Penelope had heard him muttering to the line cook about needing girls who looked better in the new uniform aprons. 2 hours later, she returned to her shoebox apartment in Pilsen, only to find a padlock on the door and a glaring eviction notice plastered to the cheap wood. Her landlord, a cruel man named Sullivan, had locked her out a week early. Now, she was shivering violently, her oversized, thrifted wool coat heavy with rainwater, smelling of damp earth and stale grease. The cold was biting into her bones. She had $3.40 in her pocket. Worse, she owed $5,000 to Arthur the Rat Russo, a mid-level loan shark who had funded her mother's hospice care before she passed away last month. Russo's men had promised to find her by midnight. It was currently 11:40. Penelope stopped under the flickering yellow glow of a broken street lamp, gasping for air, the cardboard box turning to mush in her arms. A framed photograph of her mother slipped through the deteriorating bottom, shattering on the wet pavement. A sob tore through Penelope's throat, a jagged, ugly sound that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the storm. She dropped to her knees, right there in the middle of the empty, flooded street, ignoring the icy water seeping through her jeans. Her thick fingers scrabbled desperately at the broken glass, trying to salvage the ruined photograph, her wet hair plastering across her cheeks. She was so tired. The kind of bone-deep, soul-crushing fatigue that made you want to simply lie down on the concrete and let the earth reclaim you. 3 blocks away, a sleek, obsidian Mercedes Maybach S-Class cut through the storm like a shark through dark water. In the back seat sat Cassius Costa. At 32, Cassius was the newly crowned head of the Costa Syndicate, having violently taken the reins after his father's assassination 6 months prior. He was a man carved from marble and ice, with sharp, aristocratic features, a jawline permanently clenched, and eyes the colour of a stormy sea. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than most people made in a year, a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe resting heavy on his wrist. But beneath the wealth and the terrifying reputation, Cassius was a hollow shell. He had spent his entire life being molded into a weapon, taught by his father that emotion was a liability and mercy was a death sentence. Tonight, he had personally put a bullet between the eyes of the man who had orchestrated his father's murder, a man he had known since childhood, a man who had taught him how to ride a bicycle. Cassius had felt absolutely nothing when he pulled the trigger. No satisfaction, no guilt, just a chilling, expansive emptiness that was beginning to suffocate him. "Visibility is getting worse, boss," muttered Rocco, his massive, heavily scarred driver and chief bodyguard, gripping the steering wheel. "Should have taken the Eisenhower." "Just drive, Rocco," Cassius murmured, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that demanded instant obedience. He stared out the window, watching the blurred lights of the city streak by. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, surrounded by men who feared him, women who wanted his money, and enemies who wanted his head. The Maybach rounded the corner onto West Monroe, accelerating down the empty commercial stretch. The headlights, bright as a stadium array, cut through the sheets of rain. Suddenly, Rocco slammed on the brakes. The massive armoured vehicle hydroplaned, the heavy tyres screaming against the slick pavement as it fishtailed. Cassius was thrown against the leather door panel, his hand instinctively dropping to the custom 1911 pistol holstered inside his jacket. The car lurched to a violent halt, the engine growling ominously. The headlights illuminated a horrifying scene just inches from the Maybach's chrome grille. It was a woman. She was on her knees in the middle of the road, soaked to the bone, her large frame completely illuminated by the high beams. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble out of the way. She just slowly raised her head, her face pale and streaked with mascara and rainwater, holding a piece of broken glass. "What the hell is this?" Rocco snarled, pulling his own weapon, his eyes darting to the dark alleyways, expecting an ambush. "It's a setup. Stay down, boss." But Cassius didn't stay down. His eyes locked onto the woman in the headlights. Through the torrential rain and the thick, bulletproof glass, he saw the absolute lack of self-preservation in her eyes. It wasn't the manic glint of an assassin or the terrified panic of a civilian. It was the heavy, crushing resignation of someone who had already died 1,000 times over. "Unlock the door," Cassius commanded softly. "Cassius, no. It's standard protocol." "I said, unlock the damn door, Rocco." The heavy click of the locks disengaging sounded louder than the thunder overhead. Rocco cursed under his breath, keeping his gun trained through the windshield, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. Cassius pushed the heavy armoured door open, stepping out into the deluge. The cold rain instantly assaulted him, ruining his tailored suit, but he didn't care. He walked slowly to the front of the car, his imposing, athletic frame silhouetted by the glaring headlights. He towered over the kneeling woman, casting a long, dark shadow over her. Penelope looked up at the man standing above her. He looked like the devil himself, stepped straight out of a GQ magazine and into her nightmare. She noted the subtle bulge of the shoulder holster beneath his ruined jacket, the predatory grace of his stance, the cold, dead look in his eyes. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. In a city like Chicago, the monsters didn't hide in the shadows. They drove $500,000 cars and owned the police force. Rocco was out of the car a second later, standing by the driver's side door, his gun pointed squarely at Penelope's chest. "Hands where I can see them," he barked over the rain. "Drop whatever you're holding." Penelope didn't look at the bodyguard. She didn't drop the shattered piece of the picture frame. She looked only at Cassius. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but strangely, she wasn't afraid. When you have lost everything, your mother, your home, your livelihood, and your dignity, fear loses its grip. What could this man do to her that the world hadn't already done? Kill her? At this point, it felt like a mercy. She slowly pushed herself up from the pavement. Her wet clothes clung heavily to her thick thighs and stomach. the cheap fabric highlighting every curve and roll she had spent her life trying to hide under baggy sweaters. She stood before him, soaked, shivering, and stripped of all pride. "You stepped in front of my car," Cassius said, his voice cutting through the noise of the storm, calm and utterly terrifying. "Give me one reason why my man shouldn't put a bullet in you right now." Penelope stared into his eyes. They were a striking, stormy grey, but there was no light in them. They were the eyes of a shark, cold, ancient, and entirely devoid of human warmth. But beneath that terrifying surface, Penelope saw something else. She saw an exhaustion so profound, so completely crushing, that she recognized it instantly. It was the same exhaustion that stared back at her in the mirror every morning. She took a step closer to him, ignoring Rocco's shout of warning. She was inches from Cassius now. She had to crane her neck to look up at him. She was a fat, poor, broken girl from the wrong side of the tracks. And he was a king of the underworld. But in that fleeting second, under the torrential rain, they were exactly the same. "Do it then," Penelope said, her voice shaking, but her gaze unwavering. Cassius's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. He was used to people begging, crying, offering him money, secrets, their own flesh and blood to spare their lives. He was not used to this quiet, devastating defiance. "You think I won't?" Cassius whispered dangerously, leaning in. "I think you will," Penelope replied, water dripping from her chin. "Because you're just like me." Cassius let out a harsh, bitter sound that might have been a laugh. "Look at me, sweetheart. I am nothing like you, aren't you?" Penelope stepped even closer, her chest almost brushing his jacket. She didn't care about the gun pointed at her. She didn't care about the loan sharks hunting her. She was a woman pushed entirely past her breaking point, and the dam inside her finally burst. "You look at me, and you see a pathetic fat girl with nothing, standing in the rain," Penelope said, her voice rising, thick with tears and a lifetime of suppressed rage. "But I look at you, in your expensive suit and your bulletproof car, and I know the truth. You rule this city, you hold the gun, and you have all the power in the world. But you look exactly like I feel, completely, utterly hollow." Cassius froze. The breath hitched in his throat. "You're just a ghost haunting your own life," she choked out, a tear finally escaping and mixing with the rain on her cheek. "So tell your man to shoot me. Do it. But don't pretend you're killing me for power. You're doing it because you want to feel something, anything, and you've forgotten how." The world seemed to stop spinning. The sound of the rain faded into a dull hum in Cassius's ears. Her words didn't just hit him. They pierced straight through the armor of his chest, cracking open the ice around his heart with the force of a sledgehammer. A ghost haunting your own life. It was the exact terrifying thought he had been having in the car just moments before. He stared down at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she carried her weight, not with pride, but with a defensive posture, a shield against a cruel world. He saw the deep purple bags under her eyes, the raw, bruised knuckles from hard labor, the profound, staggering loneliness radiating from her like heat from a furnace. She was messy, heavy, and broken. She was real. In a world of plastic faces and calculated lies, this woman standing in the pouring rain was the most real thing he had encountered in a decade. "Rocco," Cassius said softly, never breaking eye contact with Penelope. "Lower the weapon." "Boss, you can't be serious. She's a security risk." "Lower the damn gun, Rocco," Cassius roared, the sudden explosion of violence in his voice making both Penelope and Rocco flinch. Slowly, Rocco lowered his pistol. Cassius looked back at Penelope. She was shivering violently now, the adrenaline fading, leaving her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She looked down at the broken piece of glass in her hand, the fragment of the picture frame containing her mother's smile. She dropped it. It fell to the puddle with a small splash. "Get in the car," Cassius ordered, his tone brokering no argument. Penelope blinked, confusion replacing her defiant despair. "What? You're freezing! You're going to catch pneumonia! Get in the car!" "I don't even know you," she stammered, wrapping her arms around her thick waist, suddenly fiercely self-conscious of her soaked clothing clinging to her body. "I'm not getting in a car with a Mafia boss." A faint ghost of a smirk touched the corner of Cassius's lips. "You recognized me, yet you still talk to me like that. You're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, Miss Walsh. Penelope Walsh." "Well, Penelope Walsh," Cassius said, reaching out. He didn't grab her roughly. Instead, his large, warm hand wrapped gently around her freezing upper arm. The contact sent a jolt of pure electricity through them both. "I am Cassius Costa, and you are getting in my car because if you stay out here, you will die. And I suddenly find myself invested in your survival." Penelope didn't know why she let him guide her into the back of the Maybach. Perhaps it was the warmth radiating from the plush, temperature-controlled interior. Perhaps it was the sheer exhaustion shutting down her brain's warning systems. Or perhaps, in a dark, twisted way, it was the fact that for the first time in years, someone had actually seen her. Not her weight, not her poverty, but her. She slid awkwardly into the back seat, gasping softly as the pristine, cream-coloured leather yielded to her heavy frame. She was instantly acutely aware of how much space she took up, how her wet, dirty jeans were staining the immaculate upholstery. She tried to make herself as small as possible, pressing her back against the door, pulling her wet coat tightly around her. Cassius slid in beside her, the heavy armoured door closing with a solid, airtight thud that instantly silenced the raging storm outside. The contrast was jarring. 1 second, she was in a freezing, wet hell. The next, she was enveloped in the scent of rich leather, expensive cologne, and dangerous power. "Drive, Rocco. The Lake Forest Estate," Cassius instructed. "Boss, we have the sit-down with the Luciano family tomorrow morning. Going to the estate puts us an hour out of the city. I gave you an order, Rocco. Do not make me repeat it again tonight." Cassius's voice was a lethal whisper. The Maybach smoothly accelerated, leaving the shattered pieces of Penelope's old life in the rearview mirror. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the cabin was the soft whir of the climate control and Penelope's ragged breathing. She stared out the window, watching the city blur by, panic finally starting to claw its way up her throat. What had she done? She was sitting next to the head of the Costa family, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, terrified whispers in the diner where she worked. She was trapped in a moving vault with a murderer. "You're shivering," Cassius noted. He reached into a compartment between the seats and pulled out a thick cashmere blanket. Without asking for permission, he leaned over and draped it over her shoulders. Penelope flinched as he got close, her breath hitching. He smelled of rain, smoke, and something metallic that she sickeningly realized was blood. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered. The bravado from the street completely evaporated, replaced by the raw, naked fear of a prey animal caught in a snare. Cassius paused, his hand hovering over her shoulder. His jaw tightened. "I am not going to hurt you, Penelope. If I wanted to hurt you, you would be bleeding out on West Monroe right now. Then why am I here? I'm nobody. I have nothing. I don't have money. I don't have information, and She gestured vaguely to her heavy, soaked body, a flush of deep shame burning her cheeks. "I'm certainly not your type." Cassius slowly withdrew his hand, settling back into his seat, turning slightly to face her. His calculating, stormy eyes roamed over her face, taking in her insecurities, her shame, and the residual fire in her eyes. My type usually wants to use me, kill me, or steal from me, Cassius said softly. You are the first person in a decade who looked at me and didn't see a walking ATM or a target. You saw a hollow man. He leaned a fraction closer. How did you know? Penelope swallowed hard. Because it takes one to know one. Cassius remained silent for a long moment. Then, his eyes narrowed, catching sight of a dark purple bruise blooming on her left wrist, partially hidden by her wet sleeve. He reached out, quick as a viper, and caught her hand. Penelope gasped, trying to pull back, but his grip was like iron, though surprisingly gentle. He pushed her sleeve up, revealing a set of brutal, finger-shaped bruises marring her pale skin. Who did this? Cassius's voice dropped an octave, a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Penelope looked away, shame warring with fear. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, he stated, his thumb lightly brushing the edge of the bruise. The contrast of his large, calloused, violent hand touching her damaged skin so delicately made her breath hitch again. Tell me. It's Arthur Russo. They call him the Rat. The temperature in the car seemed to drop 20 degrees. Cassius didn't yell, he didn't curse, but his entire body went rigidly still, and the air around him became thick with a murderous intent so palpable Penelope could almost taste it. Arthur Russo was a mid-level loan shark, a bottom feeder who kicked up to a rival faction, the very faction Cassius had been systematically dismantling. You owe Russo money? 5,000, Penelope whispered, tears welling up again. For my mother's hospice. She died last month. I lost my job tonight. My landlord locked me out. Russo's men grabbed me yesterday, gave me a warning. She let out a pathetic, watery laugh. I was actually walking to the river when you almost hit me. I figured drowning was better than what Russo's men would do to me. Cassius stared at her. This woman, who possessed more courage in her little finger than half the made men in his syndicate, had been walking toward the freezing river because of $5,000 dirty dollars, an amount he spent on a bottle of whiskey without blinking. A new, unfamiliar sensation began to claw its way through the emptiness in Cassius's chest. It was dark, possessive, and fiercely protective. He had spent his life destroying things. For the first time, looking at the broken, beautiful, heavy woman trembling in his car, he felt an overwhelming urge to protect, to build a wall of fire around her and burn anyone who tried to touch her. Rocco, Cassius said, his voice deadly calm. Yeah, boss. Make a call. Find Arthur Russo. Bring him to the warehouse on 9th by tomorrow night. Penelope gasped, her eyes going wide. No! You don't have to. Penelope, Cassius interrupted, turning his full, terrifying attention back to her. His eyes were no longer dead. They were blazing with a dark, terrifying fire. He reached out, his hand cupping her soft, wet cheek. She was so unused to a gentle touch that she leaned into it involuntarily. Russo touched what is now mine. He will pay the price. Yours, she whispered, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Yes, Cassius murmured, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. You stopped my car. You saw my soul. You don't belong to the streets anymore, Penelope. You belong to me. And nobody touches what belongs to Cassius Costa. As the Maybach swept through the massive wrought iron gates of the Lake Forest estate, Penelope realized with terrifying clarity that she hadn't escaped death tonight. She had just traded one monster for another. But as she looked into Cassius's eyes, she couldn't deny the dark, thrilling warmth blooming in her chest. She had entered the lion's den, and the lion had decided to keep her. Penelope woke to the complete, absolute absence of sound. For a girl who had spent her entire life listening to the rattle of the L train, the screaming of neighbors through paper-thin walls, and the relentless drip of a broken faucet, The silence was deafening. She opened her eyes and found herself buried beneath a mountain of white Egyptian cotton, staring up at a vaulted ceiling adorned with hand-painted frescoes. Panic, cold and sharp, immediately spiked in her chest. She bolted upright, clutching the silk sheets to her chest, expecting to find Rocco's gun pointed at her or Arthur Russo's thugs waiting in the shadows. Instead, she found a cavernous bedroom bathed in the soft grey light of a Chicago morning. The walls were lined with dark mahogany bookshelves, and a massive stone fireplace stood cold on the far wall. She was wearing a plush, oversized silk nightgown that smelled faintly of cedar and expensive laundry detergent. Her wet, ruined clothes from the night before were gone. Before her panic could fully solidify, the heavy oak door clicked open. An older woman with iron-grey hair pulled into a severe bun stepped into the room, carrying a silver tray. "Good morning, Miss Walsh," the woman said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I am Beatrice. I manage the household staff for Mr. Costa. I took the liberty of drawing a bath for you in the ensuite. And I have brought some clothes." Penelope stared at her, her voice raspy from the screaming and the cold of the previous night. "My clothes were unsalvageable, I'm afraid," Beatrice said smoothly, setting the tray on a glass table. It held a steaming pot of coffee, fresh fruit, and pastries. "Mr. Costa instructed me to have a wardrobe curated for you. The boutique in the Gold Coast opened early for us." Beatrice draped several garments over the velvet armchair by the window and quietly exited the room. Penelope slowly pushed the covers aside, her bare feet sinking into a Persian rug thick enough to sleep on. She walked over to the armchair, her heart pounding. There, carefully laid out, was a dark emerald green wrap dress made of heavy, luxurious jersey. Beneath it was expensive, supportive lingerie. Penelope's breath caught. She was a size 22. She had spent her life navigating the humiliating aisles of discount stores, settling for shapeless sacks that hid her body like a shameful secret. Finding clothes that fit her large frame gracefully was an exhausting battle. Yet, as she slipped into the lingerie and wrapped the heavy emerald fabric around her body, she stared into the full-length mirror and didn't recognize the woman looking back. The dress didn't hide her, it embraced her. The deep V-neck accentuated her full chest, and the wrap cinched tightly at her waist before flowing over the wide flare of her hips and thick thighs. She didn't look like a fat, invisible girl from Pilsen. She looked imposing. She looked regal. Cassius had paid attention. He hadn't just bought her clothes, he had bought her armor. "Green suits you," Penelope gasped, spinning around. Cassius was leaning against the heavy wooden door frame. He had traded the ruined suit from the night before for a tailored, three-piece charcoal pinstripe that screamed lethal authority. His stormy eyes drifted slowly down her body, taking in the curve of her hips and the soft flush on her cheeks. There was no disgust in his gaze. There wasn't even the polite indifference she was used to. There was a dark, heavy heat that made her pulse thunder in her ears. "You shouldn't sneak up on people," Penelope managed to say, crossing her arms defensively over her stomach. "In my line of work, heavy footsteps get you killed," Cassius replied, stepping into the room. He walked to the silver tray, poured a cup of coffee, and handed it to her. His fingers brushed hers, and she flinched, remembering the violence that clung to him like a shadow. "Why am I here, Cassius?" Penelope asked, using his first name, testing the boundaries of the cage she found herself in. "You saved me. Thank you. But I can't stay here. I have a life. Well, I had a life to figure out." Cassius took a sip of his own coffee, his eyes locked onto hers over the rim of the china cup. "You have nowhere to go, Penelope. Your apartment is padlocked. You have $3 to your name, and Arthur Russo's men are still breathing. I can go to a shelter. You will stay exactly where you are," Cassius interrupted, his voice dropping to that lethal, commanding baritone. He set his cup down and picked up a thick manila folder from the table, tossing it onto the bed. Because you are no longer just a random girl I pulled off the street. You are a massive liability, and an even bigger target. Penelope frowned, stepping toward the bed. What is that? It's a dossier. Rocco had my men pull everything on you overnight. Cassius stepped closer, closing the distance between them until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Your name is Penelope Walsh. Your mother, Margaret, died of lung cancer 32 days ago, but it's your father I'm interested in. My father? Penelope scoffed, a bitter taste flooding her mouth. William Walsh was a deadbeat drunk. He walked out on my mother and me when I was 6 years old. He's probably dead in a ditch somewhere. William Walsh was not a drunk, Cassius stated, his eyes narrowing. He was a ghost, a financial architect. On the streets, they called him the accountant. And until 18 years ago, he was the chief money launderer for the Luciano crime family. My biggest rivals in Chicago. Penelope stared at him, the coffee cup trembling in her hands. You're lying. My mother cleaned hotel rooms to pay rent. We lived on food stamps. Because 18 years ago, William Walsh vanished, Cassius said softly, stepping even closer, his presence entirely engulfing her. And he didn't leave empty-handed. He embezzled $12 million from Dominic Luciano's personal accounts. Worse, he took a physical ledger, a little black book detailing every corrupt judge, every bribed police commissioner, and every buried body tied to the Luciano syndicate. The room spun. Penelope reached out, her hand finding the sturdy mahogany post of the bed to steady herself. Her entire life, the poverty, the hunger, her mother's agonizing death in a state-funded ward because they couldn't afford private care, had all been a consequence of a mafia war she knew nothing about. They couldn't find him, Cassius continued, his gaze tracking the tear that slipped down her cheek. So they watched your mother. They watched you, waiting for him to reach out, waiting for the money to surface. Arthur Russo, Penelope whispered, the pieces violently clicking into place. Russo didn't just stumble upon your mother's medical debt, Cassius confirmed, his jaw clenching with anger. The Lucianos ordered him to buy it. They wanted to squeeze you. They wanted to push you so close to the edge that you'd be forced to liquidate everything you owned, hoping that ledger would finally turn up in your mother's belongings. Cassius reached out, his thumb gently catching the tear on her jawline. The contrast between his brutal words and his tender touch was maddening. They pushed you into the street in the freezing rain to die, Penelope. They made you believe you were worthless. A new emotion ignited in Penelope's chest, burning away the fear and the exhaustion. It was white-hot, blinding rage. For 24 years, she had hated herself. She had hated her body, hated her poverty, hated her life. And it had all been orchestrated by men in expensive suits playing a game with her existence. Where are you going? Penelope asked, her voice suddenly devoid of any tremor. As Cassius turned toward the door, I have a sit-down with Dominic Luciano in an hour, Cassius said, adjusting his cuffs. I'm going to look the man who ruined your life in the eye and smile. And tonight, I'm going to the warehouse on 9th to have a very long, very painful conversation with Arthur Russo. I want to be there, Penelope demanded. Cassius paused, his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back at her. In the emerald dress, with her eyes blazing with newfound fury, she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a queen waking up to her power. No, Cassius said softly. You belong to me now, Penelope, and my things stay locked up where it's safe. He closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with the ghosts of her past and a burning desire for revenge. The air in the private back room of Il Tevere, a high-end Italian restaurant in River North, was thick with cigar smoke and decades of bad blood. Cassius sat at the head of the long oak table, his posture relaxed, a glass of scotch resting lightly in his hand. Across from him sat Dominic Luciano, a man in his late 60s with silver hair, a predatory smile, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. Flanking Dominic were 4 heavily armed men. Flanking Cassius were just Rocco and another enforcer named Silas. Cassius didn't need a small army to project power. His reputation did the heavy lifting. "It's a tragedy about your father, Cassius," Dominic said, taking a slow drag from his cohiba. "He was a reasonable man, a traditionalist. I worry the new generation lacks his restraint." "My father is dead because he trusted a snake," Cassius replied smoothly, taking a sip of his scotch. "I don't plan on making the same mistake, Dominic. We're here to discuss the port shipments. You've been stepping on my docks." Dominic chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Business is business. But the streets are talking, Cassius. They say the Ice King of Chicago lost his mind last night. Stopped his motorcade in a monsoon to pick up a stray dog off the street. A rather heavy stray, from what I hear." Rocco tensed visibly, his hand drifting toward his jacket. Cassius held up a single finger, silencing his man without looking at him. But beneath the table, Cassius's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest. "I collect many things, Dominic," Cassius said, his voice dropping to a terrifying quiet register. "What I keep in my home is my business. If you or your men ever speak of her again, I won't just take the docks. I'll take your breathing privileges." Dominic's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. He leaned forward. "Be careful, Cassius. Sometimes you pick up a piece of trash, only to find out it belongs to someone else's mess. You wouldn't want to inherit a debt you can't pay, especially a debt tied to William Walsh." Cassius didn't blink. He didn't react. He just finished his scotch, stood up, and buttoned his suit jacket. "The sit-down is over. Stay off my docks, Dominic. Next time I won't ask." He walked out of the restaurant, the cold fury radiating from him in waves. Dominic knew. The Lucianos were hunting Penelope, and now they knew she was under the protection of the Costa Syndicate. The war hadn't just started, it had arrived at his front door. Meanwhile, back at the Lake Forest estate, Penelope was pacing the length of her luxurious prison. The emerald dress swished around her legs as she walked. She felt restless. Her mind was racing with images of her mother coughing up blood in a sterile room, all while men like Dominic Luciano and Arthur Russo pulled the strings. She walked to the bedroom door and pulled it open. Standing in the hallway was a young, sharp-looking enforcer in a tailored black suit. He had dark hair, a broken nose, and eyes that looked entirely too old for his face. "Good afternoon, Miss Walsh," the guard said respectfully. "My name is Dante. I'm assigned to your door. Do you need anything? Food? Water?" "I need a car, Dante," Penelope said, stepping into the hallway. She forced herself to stand tall, throwing her shoulders back, weaponizing her size to take up as much space as possible. "Take me to the warehouse on 9th. Dante let out a dry, nervous laugh. "I can't do that, miss. The boss gave strict orders. You stay in the house. The perimeter is locked down." "Did he?" Penelope took a step closer to Dante. Her heart was hammering, but she kept her face completely stoic, channeling the cold, dead look she had seen in Cassius's eyes on the street. "Cassius told me last night that I belong to him. Do you understand what that means, Dante?" Dante shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting away from her intense gaze. "It means you're protected. It means I am his," Penelope corrected, her voice dropping, mimicking the dangerous cadence of the Mafia boss. "And Arthur Russo is the man who tortured my mother. If Cassius is down there shedding blood on my behalf, I have a right to be there. Now, you can either drive me down there, or you can explain to Cassius tomorrow why you disrespected the woman he brought into his home." It was a massive bluff. She had no idea if Cassius actually cared about her, or if she was just a shiny new toy. But she knew how men in this world operated. They operated on pride, possession, and fear. Dante stared at her, weighing his options. He had seen the way Cassius looked at this woman when he carried her into the estate. Cassius Costa hadn't brought a woman home in 5 years. Denying her could be a fatal career move. "If the boss kills me for this," Dante muttered, pulling a set of keys from his pocket, "I'm haunting you." The warehouse on 9th Street smelled of damp concrete, rust, and the metallic, coppery tang of fresh blood. It was a cavernous space, illuminated only by a few harsh industrial halogens hanging from the rafters. In the center of the room, tied tightly to a metal folding chair, was Arthur the Rat Russo. His face was a pulpy, bruised mess, his nose shattered, his expensive silk shirt stained crimson. Standing over him, with his jacket discarded and the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt rolled up to his elbows, was Cassius. His knuckles were split and bleeding. The aristocratic, cold facade was entirely gone, replaced by the monstrous, violent reality of who he truly was. "I'm going to ask you one more time, Arthur," Cassius said smoothly, picking up a heavy steel wrench from a rolling tool tray. "And if you lie to me again, I am going to shatter your kneecaps. Why did you buy Margaret Walsh's debt?" Russo spat a glob of blood onto the concrete, breathing heavily. "Costa, you're crazy. You're starting a war over a fat, useless pig from the slums. The Lucianos are going to wipe you out." Cassius swung the wrench. The sickening crack of metal on bone echoed through the warehouse, followed instantly by Russo's agonizing, high-pitched scream. "Do not ever speak of her like that again," Cassius whispered, grabbing Russo by the hair and jerking his head back. "She has more worth in a single breath than you have in your entire miserable life. Now." "The debt. They told me to!" Russo sobbed, tears streaming down his bruised face. "Dominic's right-hand man. They said William Walsh hid a ledger, a physical book. They thought if I squeezed the wife and the daughter, they'd get desperate. They'd pawn off the old man's junk, and the book would turn up. I swear to God, Cassius, that's all I know." "And did she have it?" Cassius demanded. "No, she had nothing. Just a box of garbage she was carrying around last night." The heavy metal doors at the far end of the warehouse suddenly groaned open, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense silence. Cassius dropped Russo's hair, spinning around, his hand instinctively dropping to his holstered weapon. Rocco and Silas raised their assault rifles, aiming down the dark corridor. Out of the shadows stepped Penelope. She looked entirely out of place in the blood-stained slaughterhouse. The emerald wrap dress flowed around her, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Dante walked nervously a few paces behind her, his hands raised in a placating gesture toward Rocco's rifle. "Boss, I tried to stop her, I swear," Dante stammered, sweating profusely. She insisted." Cassius's eyes went wide. For the first time in his life, genuine panic flared in his chest. He didn't want her here. He didn't want her to see this part of him. He had spent his life surrounded by monsters, but when he looked at Penelope, he wanted to be a man. "Get her out of here, Dante!" Cassius roared, taking a step toward her, desperately trying to position his body to block her view of the bloodied, broken man in the chair. "Penelope, turn around, right now." But Penelope didn't turn around. She didn't flinch at the sight of the blood, or the guns, or the terrifying violence radiating from Cassius. She walked straight toward him, her heavy step steady on the concrete floor. She looked past Cassius, her eyes locking onto Arthur Russo. The man who had terrorized her mother. The man who had driven her to the brink of the river. He looked so small now, so pathetic. "Well, well," Russo wheezed, a bloody, unhinged smile spreading across his ruined face. "If it isn't the little piggy. Did you come to watch your new boyfriend work, Penelope? You think you're safe? You're a walking corpse. Dominic Luciano knows where you are." "Shut your mouth," Cassius snarled, raising the wrench again. "Wait," Penelope said, her voice cutting clearly through the humid air. Cassius froze, turning to look at her. She stepped right up to him, so close the heat of his body radiated against her skin. She reached out and gently laid her hand over his bleeding knuckles, pushing the wrench down. She looked up into Cassius's stormy eyes. He just said they were looking for a book, because they thought I'd pawned my father's old junk. Penelope, this isn't the time. Cassius, listen to me, she interrupted, her grip tightening on his hand. Her mind was flashing back to the rain, to the street lamp, to the cardboard box melting in her arms. When my father left, my mother threw away everything he owned. Everything except one thing. A picture of the three of us. Cassius's eyes narrowed, his sharp mind instantly catching up to where she was leading him. The photograph you were holding in the street, Penelope nodded slowly, a massive wave of realization crashing over her. When I dropped it, the glass shattered, but the wooden backing split open. It wasn't just a frame, it was hollow. There was a small black notebook bound inside the cardboard backing. Complete silence fell over the warehouse. Even Russo stopped groaning, his eyes widening in horror. "Where is it?" Cassius asked, his voice barely a whisper, the magnitude of what she was saying shifting the very foundations of the criminal underworld. "I dropped it," Penelope said, looking down at her hands. "When you told me to get in the car, I dropped the broken pieces in the puddle on West Monroe." Cassius slowly turned his head to look at Rocco. Rocco was already reaching for his phone, his face pale. "I'm sending a cleanup crew to Monroe right now, boss. We'll tear up the entire street." Cassius turned back to Penelope. The hollow, dead emptiness he had felt 24 hours ago was completely eradicated. This woman hadn't just saved his soul in the rain. She had unknowingly handed him the atomic bomb he needed to annihilate his greatest enemy. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers gently cupping her jaw, heedless of the mess. "You are magnificent," he murmured, the dark, obsessive possession in his eyes burning hotter than ever. "You just won me the war." "I don't care about your war, Cassius," Penelope said fiercely, stepping into his touch. "I care about the men who hurt my mother." She slowly turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Arthur Russo. She looked back at Cassius, her voice cold and completely devoid of mercy. "Give me the wrench." The heavy, cold steel of the wrench was a stark contrast to the burning fire in Penelope's chest. Cassius didn't hesitate. He didn't tell her it was a bad idea, nor did he offer platitudes about how revenge wouldn't heal her trauma. In the violent, brutal world Cassius Costa inhabited, blood was the only currency that settled a debt. He placed the heavy tool into her soft, uncalloused hand, his fingers lingering over hers for a fraction of a second, silently transferring his lethal authority to her. "Penelope, please!" Arthur Russo shrieked, thrashing against the ropes that bound him to the metal chair. Blood bubbled at the corner of his lips. "I was just following orders. You're not a killer. Look at you. You're just a sweet girl from Pilsen." Penelope stepped closer. She looked down at the man who had ordered his thugs to terrorize a dying woman. She remembered the sheer terror in her mother's eyes when Russo's men had kicked in their door 6 months ago, demanding interest on a loan that was meant to buy Margaret Walsh a few painless months. "I am a girl from Pilsen," Penelope said, her voice eerily calm, echoing in the cavernous warehouse. "And for 24 years, men like you have looked at me and seen a target. A weak, fat, poor girl who takes up too much space but has no voice. You thought you could crush me." She raised the wrench. It was heavy, pulling at the muscles in her shoulder. "But you forgot one thing, Arthur," she whispered, her dark eyes locking onto his terrified, bulging ones. "Gravity." She didn't aim for his head. She wasn't a murderer. Cassius was right about that. But she was a survivor. She brought the heavy steel wrench down with every ounce of her substantial weight, fueled by decades of grief, humiliation, and rage. The wrench connected with Rousseau's right hand, the hand resting on the armrest of the chair, the hand that had signed the orders to torture her mother. The sound of shattering bones echoed like a gunshot. Rousseau's scream was a horrific, tearing sound that vibrated in Penelope's teeth. He convulsed against the ropes, sobbing uncontrollably as his hand hung at a sickening, impossible angle. Penelope dropped the wrench. It clattered against the blood-stained concrete. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving against the emerald silk of her dress. The adrenaline crash hit her instantly, making her knees weak. Before she could fall, Cassius was there, his strong arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her back against his solid, broad chest. "Rocco," Cassius ordered, never taking his eyes off Penelope. "Dump him at the doors of Chicago Med. Let Dominic Luciano know exactly what happens to the hands that touch my queen." Cassius turned Penelope away from the carnage, practically carrying her out to the waiting SUV. The ride back to the Lake Forest estate was shrouded in silence. Penelope stared at her hands, trembling violently. She had crossed a line. She had stepped out of the civilized world of victims and into the dark, bloody arena of predators. When they arrived at the estate, Cassius led her upstairs, bypassing the guest room and taking her directly into his own master suite. It was a massive room of dark slate, leather, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan. "I'll have Beatrice draw you a bath," Cassius said softly. "No," Penelope whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't leave." Cassius stopped. He turned to her, his stormy grey eyes softening in a way that would have terrified his enemies. He walked towards her, his large hands reaching out to gently untie the sash of her emerald dress. Penelope stiffened. A lifetime of deep-seated insecurities flared up. "Cassius, I'm not—" She struggled for the words, her cheeks burning with shame. "I'm not beautiful. I have stretch marks. I have rolls. I'm heavy." Cassius let the heavy silk fall to the floor. He didn't look away. He didn't offer a polite lie. He looked at her in her sheer lingerie, his gaze trailing over the thick curve of her thighs, the soft swell of her stomach, the lush fullness of her breasts. His eyes were dark, hungry, and filled with a profound reverence that stole the breath from her lungs. "You have been told by weak men that you are too much," Cassius rumbled, stepping into her space, his chest brushing against hers. "Because weak men are terrified of a woman who cannot be easily broken. You are not just beautiful, Penelope. You are a goddess carved from marble and storm. You carry the weight of the world, and you do it with a strength that brings me to my knees." He sank to his knees right there on the plush carpet. Penelope gasped as the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago pressed a tender, burning kiss to the soft curve of her stomach. He worshipped her body, mapping every inch of her skin with his lips, treating her perceived flaws as sacred ground. In the dark sanctuary of his bedroom, the fat, invisible girl from Pilsen died, and the queen of the Costa Syndicate was born. At 3 a.m., the heavy oak doors of Cassius's private study swung open. Rocco stood in the doorway, soaked in rainwater and mud, holding a transparent evidence bag. "We had to tear up half the asphalt on Monroe before the city plows washed it into the storm drains," Rocco reported, his voice tight with exhaustion. "But we found it." Cassius sat behind a massive mahogany desk, wearing a dark silk robe, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Penelope sat beside him in a leather armchair, draped in one of his oversized dress shirts, her hair damp from the shower. Cassius took the bag. Inside was a small black moleskin notebook. Its edges were warped and stained with dirty street water, but the thick leather cover had protected the interior pages. Cassius carefully extracted it, laying it on a clean towel on the desk. "Get Dante and secure the perimeter, Rocco. Double the guard," Cassius ordered. As Rocco left, Cassius opened the delicate, damp pages. Penelope leaned in, her shoulder pressing against his. The The pages were filled with tiny, meticulous handwriting, columns of numbers, offshore routing codes, and names of politicians, judges, and rival mob bosses. It was William Walsh's insurance policy, a roadmap to the entire corrupt infrastructure of Chicago. But as Cassius turned to the final pages, his blood ran cold. The ink here was different, newer, not written 18 years ago. Look at this. Cassius pointed to a specific ledger entry dated just 3 months prior. Transfer $4.2 million to AS Holdings. Authorization WW. WW, Penelope breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. William Walsh, but he's been missing for 18 years. Everyone thought Luciano killed him. Cassius's eyes darted down the page, cross-referencing a list of shell corporations. His jaw clenched so tight, a muscle ticked in his cheek. AS Holdings, Alexander Sterling. Penelope gasped. Alexander Sterling was a billionaire real estate developer. He was the man who had bought the entire block of low-income housing in Pilsen. He was the landlord who had orchestrated her eviction. Cassius, Penelope whispered, the horrific realization washing over her like ice water. My landlord didn't evict me because I was late on rent. He evicted me because he owned the building. Your father isn't dead, Penelope, Cassius said, his voice a lethal, quiet hiss. William Walsh changed his face, took his stolen $12 million, and built a legitimate real estate empire under the name Alexander Sterling. He orchestrated your eviction to get you out of the apartment so his private security could tear the place apart looking for this ledger. The betrayal hit Penelope with the force of a physical blow. Her own father. The man who had abandoned her and her mother to starve in the slums had been sitting in a penthouse 3 miles away. He had watched her mother die in a state-run hospice when he could have saved her with pocket change. He had thrown his own daughter into the freezing rain to find a book he had forgotten he left behind. He let her die, Penelope choked out, tears of absolute fury burning her eyes. He let my mother die in agony. Cassius closed the ledger. He stood up, pulling Penelope into his arms. He could feel the violent trembling in her heavy frame. I'm going to burn his empire to ash, Cassius vowed, pressing his lips to her forehead. I'm going to take everything he has built, and then I'm going to bring him to you. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocked the Lake Forest estate. The blast shattered the reinforced glass of the study windows, sending shards flying across the room. Cassius tackled Penelope to the floor, shielding her body with his own as the shockwave rattled the books from the shelves. The piercing shriek of the estate's perimeter alarms ripped through the night. Gunfire erupted outside, heavy automatic weapons tearing through the manicured hedges. Cassius pulled Penelope to her feet, drawing his custom 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster. Dominic Luciano, he snarled. He knows we have the ledger. He's making a desperate play. How did he get past the outer gates? Penelope shouted over the din of the alarms. You said this place was a fortress. Cassius's eyes darkened with a terrifying realization. Because Alexander Sterling's development company built the security architecture for this estate 10 years ago, your father just sold us out to the Lucianos to get his book back. The hallways of the estate were chaotic. Gunsmoke filled the air, acrid and blinding. Rocco and Dante were holding the grand staircase, exchanging suppressing fire with Luciano's heavily armed hit squad who had breached the foyer. Cassius shoved Penelope behind a marble pillar in the upstairs gallery. Stay here, he commanded, his voice brokering no argument. Do not move until I come for you. Cassius, no. Penelope grabbed his arm. They want the ledger. They want me. I can negotiate. You are not negotiating with men who want to put a bullet in your head, Cassius roared, the protective fury in his eyes absolute. You belong to me, and I protect what is mine. He tore himself away, diving into the fray. Penelope watched in horror as the man she was falling dangerously in love with turned into a demon of war. Cassius moved with terrifying precision, dropping 2 of Luciano's men with clinical headshots before taking cover behind a heavy mahogany credenza. But there were too many. Dominic Luciano had sent a small army, desperate to erase the evidence of his crimes. Penelope looked down at her hands. She was tired of hiding. She was tired of being the collateral damage in men's wars. She clutched the damp moleskin ledger in her hand. She was William Walsh's daughter, and she had the one thing both sides were willing to die for. She took a deep breath, stepping out from behind the marble pillar. "Dominic!" Penelope screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing over the crackle of gunfire. The shooting abruptly paused. Everyone, including Cassius, froze, looking up at the heavy, imposing woman standing at the top of the grand staircase. She was wrapped in Cassius's oversized shirt, but she stood with the posture of an empress. She held the black book high in the air. "You want the ghost's ledger?" she yelled down into the smoke-filled foyer. "Here it is." From the shadows of the broken front doors, Dominic Luciano stepped forward. He looked older, desperate, flanked by his remaining gunmen. "Give it to me, girl. Hand it over, and I'll let you walk out of here. Cassius Costa is a dead man anyway." "Penelope, get back!" Cassius shouted from behind his cover, genuine terror in his voice. "You think I'm stupid, Dominic?" Penelope sneered, slowly walking down the first few steps. She weaponized her size, dominating the space, projecting an aura of absolute fearlessness. "I've read it. I know about the bribes to the Port Authority. I know about the unmarked graves under the new stadium. If I drop this book into this fireplace," she gestured to the massive stone hearth at the landing, "you lose your only leverage against the feds." Dominic sneered, raising his own pistol. "If you burn it, I shoot you where you stand. Shoot me, and the Costa Syndicate releases the digital copies I made 10 minutes ago to the FBI. Penelope lied smoothly, not missing a beat. "You're trapped, old man, but I offer you a trade." Dominic narrowed his eyes. "What trade?" "My father, Alexander Sterling," Penelope said, the name tasting like poison on her tongue. "He betrayed you 18 years ago. He betrayed me today. Bring him to me, alive. Do that, and Cassius will allow you to retreat to your territory. We keep the book, but we don't leak it. A Cold War." "Penelope, no!" Cassius roared. "Do we have a deal, Dominic?" Penelope demanded, ignoring Cassius. Dominic looked at his dwindling men, then at Cassius's entrenched forces, and finally at the fierce, unyielding woman on the stairs. He slowly lowered his gun. "Sterling is flying out of O'Hare in 2 hours. Private terminal. I'll text you the tail number. You have my word." Dominic signaled his men, and they slowly backed out of the ruined doors, melting into the stormy night. The silence that followed was deafening. Penelope's legs finally gave out. She collapsed onto the carpeted stairs, the ledger slipping from her fingers. A second later, Cassius was there. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, pulling her violently into his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, his massive frame shaking. "Never," Cassius breathed, his voice ragged. "Never do that again. I thought I lost you." Penelope wrapped her arms around his thick neck, crying softly against his shoulder. "I had to. He would have killed you, Cassius. I couldn't let him kill you." Cassius pulled back, cupping her face in his hands. He looked at her not just with desire, but with absolute awe. She had walked into the crossfire of a Mafia war and brought the most dangerous man in Chicago to heel with nothing but her intellect and her bravery. "You are a terrifying woman, Penelope Walsh," Cassius murmured, a dark smile spreading across his face. "And I am completely, irreversibly obsessed with you." He crushed his lips to hers in a bruising, desperate kiss. It tasted of smoke, salt, and absolute victory. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline glittered under a clear night sky. In the penthouse of the newly acquired Costa Tower, Penelope stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a custom-made gown of midnight blue that hugged her heavy, beautiful curves perfectly. Around her neck rested a collar of flawless diamonds. The underworld had changed. Dominic Luciano had suffered a fatal heart attack 2 months prior, a quiet arrangement orchestrated by Cassius. And Alexander Sterling, William Walsh, was currently rotting in a federal supermax prison. Anonymous tips and financial records having miraculously found their way to the IRS and the FBI. Cassius stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, looking out at the city they now ruled together. "They're calling you the Iron Queen," Cassius whispered, pressing a kiss to her neck. Penelope smiled, leaning back into the heat of her husband. She had walked into the rain a broken, invisible girl with nothing. She had stopped a monster's car, and in doing so, had found the only man capable of loving the monster inside of her. She was heavy, she was scarred, and she was the most powerful woman in the city. "Let them call me whatever they want," Penelope said softly, turning her head to capture his lips. "As long as they know who I belong to, and who belongs to me." What an explosive finale! From a desperate girl in the freezing rain to the untouchable Iron Queen of Chicago, Penelope's journey proves that true power isn't about fitting into society's mold, it's about shattering it entirely. Cassius and Penelope burned the city down to build their empire. But do you think William Walsh will ever find a way out of federal prison to seek his